Welcome to Bookish Mind, Season 3, Episode 9. Today, we uncover how emotional intelligence can make or break a marriage in a world where love alone is no longer enough. And welcome back to the deep dive, where we take your source material and distill the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. Today, we're plunging into some truly fascinating research. It unpacks how our emotional worlds, often shaped way back in childhood, played this surprisingly powerful role in, well, the longevity and health of our most intimate relationships. We'll be drawing heavily from the foundational work of Daniel Goleman on emotional intelligence and the groundbreaking studies of psychologist John Gottman.
Yeah, and what's truly compelling of these experts is how they move beyond the usual kind of surface level reasons marriages succeed or fail. They really peel back the layers, to reveal these unseen emotional currents and even physiological responses that can either bind a couple together or tear them apart. Our mission today is to help you understand these powerful forces and, crucially, what you can actually do about them in your own life.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Sigmund Freud famously stated that to love and to work are the twin capacities marking full maturity. But if that's the benchmark, you have to wonder, is maturity becoming an endangered concept in our relationships? Because when we look at modern marriage trends, the picture is quite stark.
It really is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the risk of divorce for newly married couples has seen a perilous climb over the last century or so. Get this. For American marriages starting way back in 1890, only about 10% ended in divorce. Pretty low. By 1950, it had climbed to 30%. Then by 1970, a newlywed couple faced pretty much a 50-50 chance of splitting up. And for those married in 1990, the likelihood of their marriage ending in divorce was estimated at a staggering 67%. If that estimate holds true, it means maybe just 3 in 10 recent newlyweds might expect to stay married to their partner.
Oh, wow. That's a dramatic shift, absolutely. Now, some might argue this rise is simply due to the erosion of, external social pressure.
Like the stigma around divorce or women needing to be economically dependent, things like that.
Exactly. Those things used to keep even deeply unhappy couples together. But if those external glues are gone, then it stands to reason that the internal emotional forces between partners become that much more critical for survival.
Precisely. And this raises a really important question. How can we truly understand these often invisible emotional forces? The breakthrough really comes from using sophisticated physiological measures. Scientists can now track moment-to-moment emotional nuances, like, say, a husband's invisible adrenaline surges, or these fleeting micro-expressions on a wife's face. These measures reveal a critical emotional reality that's often imperceptible even to the couple themselves. They basically lay bare the relationship's fault lines.
This brings us to a particularly fascinating aspect of this research. This common pattern in distressed couples, often described as, she seeks to engage, he withdraws. It can sound almost like a sitcom, that kind of contradictory plea, aimed at a retreating back, oh, for goodness sakes, come back here and be nice to me. But it's a real and deeply painful dynamic that marital therapists see constantly.
And the roots of these profound emotional differences, they can be traced surprisingly far back, often right into childhood. Research consistently shows boys and girls inhabit largely separate emotional worlds from a very young age. By age 7, for instance, almost no boys or girls say they have a best friend of the opposite sex. Their separate social universes intersect very little until, really, the teenage dating years.
It's compelling to think how parents, often quite unconsciously, teach boys and girls vastly different lessons about handling emotions. For example, parents generally discuss emotions more extensively with their daughters, with the notable exception of anger. Mothers, in particular, tend to use more emotion-focused words when telling stories to daughters, and they display a wider range of emotions to infant daughters.
In contrast, for sons, mothers often go into more detail about the causes and consequences of emotions like anger, but often more as a cautionary tale, like, don't do this. Researchers like Leslie Brody and Judith Hall suggest that because girls tend to develop language skills a bit more quickly, they become more adept at articulating feelings, using words to explore emotions rather than, say, resorting to physical fights. Boys, with less emphasis on verbalizing these effects, might become largely unconscious of their own emotional states, and often those of others too.
And this foundational difference, it really shapes how we navigate relationships later on, doesn't it? Think about how kids play. Girls often prioritize cooperation in smaller, intimate groups. If someone gets upset, the game often stops, everyone gathers around.
Right, whereas boys, often in larger, more competitive games, learn to kind of suppress upset so the game can just keep going. If a boy cries, he's often told to get out of the way.
That subtle conditioning shapes these profound differences. It leads to some telling distinctions later. By age 13, girls are often more adept at sort of nuanced social tactics like ostracism or gossip,
Yeah, the artful aggression.
while boys might remain more overtly confrontational, sometimes completely oblivious to these more covert strategies.
And this illustrates just one of many ways that boys, and later men, often develop, let's say, less sophistication in the really nuanced byways of emotional life. This fits with what Harvard's Carol Gilligan calls a key disparity. Boys tend to pride themselves on lone independence, while girls often see themselves as part of a web of connectedness. So boys feel threatened by challenges to their independence. Girls feel threatened by a rupture in relationships.
And Deborah Tannen pointed this out too, right? Men often prefer talking about things, while women tend to seek that emotional connection through talk.
Exactly. The downstream effect is fascinating. Women generally become more adept at reading emotional signals, both verbal and nonverbal, and expressing feelings. Men, conversely, often become adept at minimizing emotions that have to do with vulnerability, guilt, fear, hurt, those kinds of things. Hundreds of studies confirm that women are, on average, more empathic and expressive and tend to experience emotions with maybe greater intensity and volatility.
So, bringing this back to marriage, what does this all mean? It generally means women arrive at marriage kind of groomed, in a sense, for the role of emotional manager, while men often arrive with considerably less appreciation for how important that management actually is. For many women, satisfaction in the relationship really hinges on what they call good communication.
And that's often where the disconnect arises.
Yeah.
Ted Houston, a psychologist who studies couples, found that for wives, intimacy frequently means talking things over, having deep conversations. Men, by and large, often don't quite get this. They might say something like, look, I want to do things with her, and all she wants to do is talk. Interestingly, during courtship, men might be more willing to engage in that kind of talk. But once married, they often retreat into finding closeness in shared activities, like, I don't know, gardening or watching sports together.
And this can lead to men often having a rosier view of the marriage than their wives do.
Yeah, because the wives are often more attuned to the trouble spots, the underlying issues, and they're usually more vocal about their complaints.
And this is a critical point you made earlier. It's not the specific issues, usually sex, kids, money, that ultimately make or break a marriage.
No, it's how a couple discusses those sore points. If they can't bridge or overcome these really deeply ingrained gender differences in approaching difficult emotions, they're just far more vulnerable to these emotional rifts that can eventually tear them apart.
Okay, so let's talk about those rifts. Perhaps the biggest breakthrough in understanding what truly destroys marriages comes from John Gottman's lab. He pioneered tracking hundreds of couples using incredibly detailed methods. Physiological sensors, second-by-second facial analysis.
Yeah, even having partners narrate their secret thoughts while watching videos of their own arguments. It's like an emotional x-ray.
Wow. And the results were astounding, weren't they?
Phenomenal. Gottman was able to predict which couples would divorce within 3 years with 94% accuracy. That kind of precision was just unheard of in marital studies. And he identified critical warning signs, starting with what he calls the first of the four horsemen of the apocalypse: harsh criticism.
Okay, criticism versus a complaint. That distinction seems incredibly subtle, but you're saying it's pivotal. Can you really unpack that for us? Why is it so easy to cross that line?
Absolutely. A healthy marriage has room for complaints. A complaint is specific about a behavior. When you forgot to pick up my clothes, it made me feel like you don't care about me. It's assertive, addresses an action. But too often, anger twists a complaint into a character assassination. That's criticism. Take Gottman's example of Pamela and Tom. Tom was late, he apologized, but Pamela just lashed out with sarcasm. Oh, that's okay. It gave us a chance to discuss your amazing ability to screw up every single plan we make. You're just so thoughtless and self-centered.
Ouch, that's definitely attacking the person, not the action.
Exactly. A personal criticism uses the grievance for a global attack. You're always so selfish and uncaring. It just proves I can't trust you to do anything right.
Mm.
This leaves the recipient feeling ashamed, blamed, defective, which almost always leads to defensiveness, not improvement.
And that defensiveness often escalates things further, leading to what Gottman calls the most destructive emotion: contempt.
Precisely. Contempt often comes laced with anger. And it's expressed not just in words, but powerfully through tone and body language. You know, the sneer, the curled lip, the dismissive eye roll.
Oh, brother, look.
Exactly. And this unspoken communication has a serious physiological toll. When one spouse regularly shows contempt, the other's heart rate literally jumps. Gottman found that if a husband consistently shows contempt, his wife is more prone to actual health problems, colds, infections, things like
Oh,
that.
well.
And if a wife's face shows disgust, which is a close cousin of contempt, 4 or more times in just a 15-minute conversation, it's a powerful silent predictor that the couple will likely separate within 4 years.
So criticism and contempt are the early warnings. What's the destructive next step in this downward spiral?
Well, the recipient often responds with defensiveness. One common way is to fight back, right? Which often leads to just fruitless shouting matches where nothing gets resolved. The more insidious alternative, though, particularly common for men, is emotional flight, just retreating into stony silence. Gottman calls this stonewalling.
Stonewalling. That sounds like a complete shutdown, like putting up a wall.
It is. The stonewaller effectively goes blank, withdraws entirely from the interaction. It sends this really unnerving message of icy distance, dislike, even disgust. This behavior showed up mainly in troubled marriages in his research, and in about 85% of cases, it was husbands stonewalling in response to criticism and contempt from their wives. And it's devastating because, as a habitual response, it just cuts off all possibility of working through disagreements. There's nowhere to go.
And beyond the spoken words, there's this whole other layer, this parallel conversation happening silently in our minds that can totally poison a marriage. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, he explains this really well. He gives an example. Martin and Melanie with their kids. Martin might say aloud, "Dear, don't you think the kids could quiet down a bit?"
Right. Sounds reasonable enough on the surface.
But his silent, automatic thought might be, "She's always too easy on the kids." Then Melanie hears his tone, his exasperation, and she feels anger, thinking to herself, there he goes again, complaining about everything.
Exactly. These automatic thoughts, these fleeting background assumptions, they profoundly shape the real emotional exchange. Melanie's internal thought is maybe, he's always bullying me with his anger. Martin's might be, she has no right to treat me like this. They each end up feeling like an innocent victim, or just full of righteous indignation.
And these thoughts are incredibly powerful, aren't they? They can trip our neural alarm system, leading straight into what Goleman calls emotional hijackings. When Martin feels victimized like that, he can easily dredge up a whole list of past grievances, completely disregarding any kindness she might have shown recently. It becomes a no-win situation for her.
Absolutely. Even intentional acts of kindness can just get filtered out or dismissed through this negative lens. Partners who are free of these distress-triggering views, though, they can interpret situations much more benignly. They embody what Martin Seligman calls an optimistic outlook. The pessimistic view is, he's selfish and self-absorbed. That's just the way he is, and he'll always be that way. Well, that guarantees misery, right? The optimistic view, however, is more like, okay, he's being demanding right now, but he's been thoughtful in the past. Maybe something's bothering him at work. That perspective sees a bad moment as changeable, something specific and temporary. It soothes distress instead of fueling it. Pessimistic thinking, of course, just fuels the criticism, the contempt, and that whole destructive cycle.
And this whole destructive cycle, the negative thoughts, the hijackings, it ultimately leads to what Gottman calls flooding.
Yes, flooding. That occurs when these distressing attitudes create this state of almost incessant crisis, leading to frequent emotional hijackings. Flooded partners are so overwhelmed by negativity and their partners, their own reactions, that they're just swamped by these dreadful, out-of-control feelings. They literally can't hear clearly, they can't think straight, they can't respond rationally, they just want it all to stop, or they want to run away, or maybe strike back. It's a really nasty, self-perpetuating cycle of emotional overload.
So how do you know if you're actually flooded? Is there like a physical sign, a tell?
Yeah, technically there is. It's usually marked by a rapid rise in your heart rate, typically about 10 beats per minute or more above your normal resting rate. If it hits, say, 100 beats per minute, your body is pumping adrenaline. Your emotions are so intense, your perspective narrows right down, your thinking gets confused. Rational discussion just becomes impossible at that point.
Okay, so while everyone probably has these intense moments sometimes, the real danger is when one or both spouses feel flooded almost continually.
That's exactly it. They start to think the worst of their partner, they interpret everything negatively, even small issues ballooned into major battles. And this completely sabotages any attempt to actually work things out constructively. It often leads to couples living these parallel lives, feeling isolated, and eventually divorce.
This brings us back squarely to those gender differences you mentioned earlier.
It does. Robert Levinson's study of long-married couples found that women, on average, don't mind plunging into marital squabbles nearly as much as men do. Husbands pretty much uniformly found it unpleasant, even really aversive, to get upset during a disagreement.
So, given how overwhelming that physical response to the flooding can be, particularly for men, does Gottman's research suggest that stonewalling is almost like a biological defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to regulate that internal chaos?
That seems to be a big part of it, yes. More men than women react to criticism with flooding. They secrete more adrenaline, and they simply take longer to recover physiologically from that state.
Okay.
It suggests that the stereotypical stoic Clint Eastwood male imperturbability might actually be a defense against feeling completely emotionally overwhelmed.
Makes sense.
And Gottman's research explicitly showed that when men began stonewalling, their heart rates often dropped by about 10 beats per minute. So subjectively, they felt some relief.
Ah, okay.
But here's the paradox. Once the men stonewalled, it was the wives whose heart rates shot up into high distress levels. Gottman calls this the limbic tango, this physiological dance where men want to avoid emotional confrontation as fervently as their wives often feel compelled to seek them out to get resolution.
And that creates that asymmetric cycle we talked about. Wives pursue to resolve things. Husbands retreat. Wives then might increase the volume, criticize more. Husbands get defensive or just shut down Stonewall.
Then wives, in frustration, maybe add contempt.
Mm-hmm.
Husbands fled completely,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, just spinning further and further out of control.
It sounds like a guaranteed recipe for breakdown if it becomes the norm.
It can absolutely be. But, given this grim potential, what can couples actually do? The crucial insight here from both Goleman and Gottman is that it's less about the specific issues, money, kids, whatever,
Right.
and more about cultivating a couple's shared emotional intelligence.
Shared emotional intelligence. Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Does Gottman offer specific strategies for navigating these deep-seated patterns?
He offers very specific, practical advice. For men, the primary advice is, don't just sidestep conflict. Try to reframe it. Realize that when your wife brings up a grievance, she might actually be doing it as an act of love, trying to keep the relationship healthy and connected. Grievances that just get buried, they tend to fester and then explode later. Airing them, even if it's a bit messy or angry, releases that pressure. Men need to try and understand that a wife's anger is often just an underline, emphasizing the strength of her feelings, not necessarily a personal attack on him.
And crucially, avoid jumping immediately to solutions, I imagine.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Men need to guard against short-circuiting the discussion by offering a practical fix too early. It's typically much more important to a wife that she feels her husband genuinely hears her complaint and empathizes with her feelings about it, even if he doesn't fully agree with her perspective. Offering advice too soon can easily sound like dismissing her feelings altogether. Husbands who can manage to stay present through the heat of the anger really help their wives feel heard and respected. That actually allows her to calm down, and then the conversation can move forward.
Okay, that makes sense. And for women, what's the parallel advice then?
The advice is quite reciprocal, actually. Since men often struggle with the intensity of complaints and are, as we said, more prone to flooding, wives need to make a purposeful effort not to attack their husbands personally. Complain about what he did specifically, not criticize him as a person or express contempt. An angry personal attack will almost certainly trigger defensiveness or stonewalling, and the fight just escalates. It also helps immensely if a wife can frame her complaints within the larger context of reassuring her husband of her underlying love and commitment to the relationship.
That context is important. The morning paper once offered this stark, if extreme, lesson in how not to resolve differences. A wife apparently shot her husband over a dispute about watching football versus the news.
Oh my.
Obviously extreme, but it certainly highlights how disagreements can spiral dangerously. So, how do healthy couples manage to have good fights? Is there such a thing?
There absolutely is. Couples in lasting, successful marriages, they tend to stick to one topic at a time. They give each partner ample chance to state their view clearly. But critically, they actively show each other they are being listened to. That feeling of being heard is often exactly what the aggrieved partner needs most. Empathy is a masterful tension reducer.
And a crucial difference you mentioned earlier, I recall, is the presence or absence of what Gottman calls repair mechanisms.
That's right. In couples heading for divorce, attempts to de-escalate tension are noticeably missing. They just keep escalating. Repair mechanisms, things like intentionally keeping the discussion on track, expressing empathy, using humor appropriately, finding points of agreement, offering signs of affection. They act like an emotional thermostat, preventing things from boiling over. The overall strategy ultimately is to cultivate that shared emotional intelligence, learning to calm yourselves down, practicing empathy, and really listening well. These are the tools that allow for those good fights that actually strengthen a marriage rather than fracture it.
These aren't easy skills, though, are they? Especially not in the heat of a confrontation. They have to be, what did Goleman say, overlearned.
Exactly. Because our emotional brain tends to default to those response routines learned earliest in life, often without us even realizing it.
So how do we practically go about this sort of remedial education in emotional intelligence within a relationship?
Well, Gottman and others lay out some key actionable strategies. First, and maybe most foundational, is calming down. Nothing constructive gets resolved during an emotional hijacking or when you're flooded. You must learn skills to soothe your own distressed feelings and recover quickly from that state of overwhelm.
Okay, how can someone practically apply that? I mean, what does calming down actually look like in the middle of an argument?
Well, ambitious couples, or those in therapy, might actually learn to monitor their pulse rates during a discussion.
Really?
Yeah. If your pulse rises more than, say, 10 beats per minute above your calm baseline, that's a pretty good sign you're flooding. At that point, the advice is to take a full 20-minute break from each other.
20 minutes. That long.
It takes at least that long for the adrenaline and other stress hormones to actually subside physiologically. You need that time to cool down properly, or, much simpler, just have a pre-stated agreement. At the first signs of overwhelm, feeling defensive, wanting to lash out, heart pounding, you call a timeout. No blame, just I need a break. And use that time, actively engage in relaxation techniques, deep breathing, take a walk, listen to calming music, not just stewing.
Okay, step one, calm down. What's next?
Second is detoxifying self-talk. Remember those automatic negative thoughts we talked about? Since flooding is often triggered by those harsh negative judgments about your partner, it helps immensely if you tackle those thoughts head on. Thoughts like, I'm not going to take this anymore, or she always does this. Those are classic innocent victim or righteous indignation slogans that just pour fuel on the fire.
So you notice the thought, you catch it, and then what's the next step? How do you challenge it?
As Aaron Beck points out, you actively challenge them. First, realize you don't have to believe every single thought that pops into your head, especially when you're upset. Make an intentional effort to bring to mind evidence that questions that harsh thought. So if you find yourself thinking, he doesn't care about my needs, he's always so selfish, actively remind yourself of specific times your husband has been thoughtful or supportive. You reframe it internally. Okay, well, he does show he cares sometimes, even though what he just did was indeed thoughtless and it's really upsetting me right now. That simple reframe opens the possibility of change and de-escalation, rather than just solidifying the negative view.
Okay, that makes sense. Calming down, challenging the thoughts. What's the third strategy?
Third is non-defensive listening and speaking. Listening. True listening is an absolutely vital skill that keeps couples together. Even in the heat of an argument, you need to try to listen past the anger, past the harsh tone, to hear your partner's underlying message, or maybe even any implicit peace offerings hidden in there.
But what if they're really raising their voice or using, really harsh language? How do you possibly listen non-defensively then?
It takes real effort, but it helps to purposely try to edit what you hear.
Yeah.
Consciously choose to ignore the hostile tone, the insult, the contempt, if possible. Try to tune into the main message, which is often an implicit statement of distress, pain, or unmet need that requires attention. So if your partner yells, "Would you just stop interrupting me, for crying out loud?"
Yeah.
You might, with practice, be able to say, without reacting defensively to the hostility, something calm like, "Okay, sorry, go ahead and finish." It takes practice, but it's incredibly powerful when you can manage it.
And you said the most powerful form of non-defensive listening is empathy.
Absolutely. Truly hearing the feelings behind what is being said. Your own emotional reactions have to calm down enough for your physiology, your mind, to actually mirror or attune to your partner's feelings. One incredibly effective method for this is called mirroring. When one partner complains, the other repeats the complaint back in their own words, trying to capture both the core thought and the underlying feelings. And you check for accuracy. Is this right? Is this how you're feeling? Until the aggrieved partner feels truly deeply heard. That profound sense of being emotionally understood can completely disarm an attack.
Okay, and then how do you speak non-defensively? You've listened, now you need to respond.
Keep it to a specific complaint about a behavior, not a personal attack on their character. Psychologist Haim Janot recommended the XYZ formula. When you did X, the specific behavior, it made me feel Y you're feeling, and I'd rather you did Z, a specific positive request instead.
So instead of, "You're such a thoughtless, selfish jerk,"
Right. You try something like, "When you didn't call last night to tell me you were going to be late X, I felt really unappreciated and angry. Why?" In the future, I'd really appreciate it if you just give me a quick call, Z. Open communication here means no bullying, no threats,
Yeah.
no insults, and crucially, no defensiveness in your own response.
And finally, there's an overarching principle that kind of underpins all of this, right? Something about respect and love.
Yes, absolutely. The fundamental role of respect and love, even amidst conflict. This means actively letting your partner know you can see things from their perspective, even if you don't agree with it. It means taking responsibility for your part in the conflict, offering a sincere apology when appropriate. At a bare minimum, validation means conveying that you are listening and acknowledging their emotions. Simply saying, I see you're really upset right now. And crucially, this isn't just about fights. Outside of arguments, it means consistently offering compliments, expressing genuine appreciation, showing affection, performing small acts of kindness. This builds up what Gottman calls emotional capital, like money in the bank, which makes navigating the inevitable conflicts much, much easier.
Right, so these strategies, they need to be practiced consistently, not just pulled out in the heat of battle, but in calmer, non-stressful moments too.
Exactly. So they become an acquired first response, part of your emotional repertoire, helping you build a truly resilient and hopefully happier partnership.
Well, today we took a deep dive into some, frankly, surprising data on divorce trends. The profound gender differences that shape our emotional worlds, and those destructive patterns that can really sabotage even the most loving marriages. We explored how Gottman's four horsemen, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, along with those toxic automatic thoughts and the experience of emotional flooding, can seriously erode connection over time.
But crucially, we also unpack concrete, research-backed strategies rooted squarely in emotional intelligence. Learning to calm down, detoxifying your internal self-talk, and mastering the art of non-defensive listening and speaking. These really are the tools that allow for those good fights, the kind that transform conflict from a purely destructive force into an opportunity for deeper understanding, connection, and resilience in the relationship.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that love alone, while absolutely essential, isn't always enough to navigate the sheer complexities of long-term partnership. It's the emotional skills we cultivate, consciously and consistently, that truly seem to matter for the long haul.
Absolutely. So for you, our listener, maybe here's a provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up. What small emotional habit, maybe one learned unconsciously way back in childhood, might you be bringing into your most intimate relationships right now that could be subtly undermining connection, maybe without you even realizing it? And perhaps more importantly, what single conscious shift could you begin to practice starting today to start rewriting that emotional script, not just for a marriage maybe, but for all your closest bonds?